Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Chapter 4. The Houyhnhnms' Notion of Truth and Falsehood. The author's discourse disapproved by his master. The author gives a more particular account of himself, and the accidents of his voyage. My master heard me with great appearances of uneasiness in his countenance, because doubting or not believing are so little known in this country, that the inhabitants cannot tell how to behave themselves under such circumstances. And I remember in frequent discourses with my master concerning the nature of manhood in other parts of the world, having occasion to talk of lying and falsehood representation. It was with much difficulty that he comprehended what I meant, and that although he had otherwise a most acute judgment, for he argued thus, that the use of speech was to make us understand one another, and to receive information of facts. Now, if anyone said the thing which was not, these ends were defeated, because I cannot properly be said to understand him, and I am so far from receiving information, that he leaves me worse than ignorance. For I am led to believe that a thing black when it is white, and short when it is long, and these were all the notions he had concerning that the faculty of lying, so perfectly well understood among human creatures. To return from this digression, which when I asserted that the Yahoos were only governing animals in my country, which my master said was altogether in his past conception, he desired to know whether we had Houyhnhnms among us, and what were their employment. I told him we had great numbers, and that in the summer they grazed the fields, and in the winter were kept in houses, with hay and oats, where Yahoo servants were employed to rub their skins smooth, comb their manes, pick their feet, and serve them with food, and make their beds. I understand you well, said my master. It is now very plain, for all you have spoken, that whatever share of reasons the Yahoos pretend to, the Houyhnhnms are your masters. I heartily wish our Yahoos would be so tractable. I begged his honour to please excuse me from the proceeding any farther, because I was very certain that the account he expected from me would be highly displeasing. He insisted in commanding me to let him know the best and the worst. I told him he should be obeyed. I owned that the Houyhnhnms among us, who we called horses, were the most generous and comely animal we had, that they excelled in strength and swiftness, and when they belonged to a person of quality, employed in travelling, racing, or drawing chariots, they were treated with much kindness and care, until they fell into diseases, or became foundered in their feet. And then they were sold, used to all kinds of drudgery till they died, after which their skins were stripped and sold for what they were worth, and their bodies were left to be devoured by dogs, and birds of prey. But their common race of horse had not so good fortune, being kept by farmers and carriers and other mean people, who put them into great labour, and fed them worse. I described, as well as I could, our way of riding in the shape and use of a bridle, a saddle, a spur, a whip, of harness and wheels. I added that we fastened plates to a certain hard substance called iron at the bottom of their feet, to preserve their hoofs from being broken by stony ways on which we often travelled. My master, after some great indignation, wondered how we dared to venture upon a Houyhnhnm's back, for he was sure that the weakest servant in his house would be able to shake off the strongest Yahoo, or by laying down and rolling on his back, squeezed the brute to death. I answered that our horses were trained for 3 or 4 years old to the use we intended them for that if any of them proved intolerably vicious, they were employed for carriages, and that they were severely beaten while they were young for any mischievous tricks, that the males were designed for common use of riding or draught, were generally castrated about 2 years after birth, to take down their spirits and make them more tame and gentle, that they were indeed sensible of rewards and punishment. But his honour would please to consider that they had not the least tincture of reason, any more than the Yahoos in this country. It put me to the pain which many circumlocutions to give my master a right idea of what I spoke, for their language doth not abound in variety of words, because their wants and passions were fewer than among us, and it was impossible to represent his noble resentment at our savage treatment of the Hunnimin race, particularly after I had explained the manner of using and of castrating horses, and making them more servile. He said, if it were possible there could be any country where Yahoos were endued with reason, they certainly must be the governing animal, because reason will time always prevail against brutal strength. But, considering the frame of our bodies, and especially of mine, he thought no creature of equal bulk was so ill contrived, for employing the reason is the common office of life. Whereupon he desired to know whether those among whom I lived resembled me or the Yahoos of his country. I assured him that I was as well shaped as most of my age, but younger, and the females was much more soft and tender, and the skin of latter generally as white as milk. He said I differed indeed from other Yahoos, being much more cleanly, and not altogether so deformed. But in point, my real advantage, he thought I differed from for the worst, that my nails were of no use to either my fore or hinder feet. As to my forefeet, he could not properly call them by that name, for he never observed me to walk upon them, and that they were too soft to bear the ground, and I generally went with them uncovered. Neither was the covering I sometimes wore on them of the same shape, of so strong as my feet on behind, that I could not walk with any security. If either my hinder feet slipped, I must inevitably fall. He began to find fault with other parts of my bodies. He noticed the flatness of my face, the prominence of my nose, my eyes placed directly in front, so that I could not look on either side without turning my head, that I was not able to feed myself without lifting one of my forefeet into my mouth, and therefore nature had placed those joints to answer that necessity. He knew not what could be the use of several clefts in division in my feet, that these were too soft to bear the hardness and sharpness of stones, without a covering made from the skin of other brute, and that my whole body wanted a fence against the heat or cold, which I was forced to put on off every day with tedious and trouble. And lastly, he observed every animal in this country naturally to be abhor the Yahoos, whom the weaker avoided, and the stronger drove from them, so that, supposing us to have gift of reason, he could not see how it were possible to cure that natural antipathy, which every creature discovered against us, nor, consequently, could we have tamed and rendered them serviceable. However, he would, as he said, debate that matter no farther, because he was more desirous to know my story, the country where I was born, and the several actions and events of my life before I came hither. I assured him how extremely desirous that I was that he should be satisfied in every point, but I doubted much whether it was because it was possible for me to explain myself on several subjects whereof his honour could have no conception, because I saw nothing in his country which I could resemble them. That, however, I would do my best, and strive myself to the similitudes, and humbly desiring his assistance when he wanted the proper words. He was pleased to promise me. I said, my birth was of honest parents, in an island called England, which was remote from this country, and many days away journey, as the strongest of his honour servants could travel in any annual course of the sun. That I was bred as a surgeon, whose trade it is to cure wounds and hurts in the body, got by accident or violence. That in my country was governed by a female man, who we called a queen. That I left it to get riches I might be maintained by myself and the family when I should return. That my last voyage I was the commander of ship, and had about 50 Yahoos under me, many of which died at sea, and I was forced to supply them by others picked out from several nations. That our ship was twice as danger of being sunk, the first time by a great storm, and the second striking against a rock. Here my master interposed, asking me how could I persuade strangers out of a different country to venture with me, after the losses I had sustained, and the hazards I'd run. I said they were fellows of desperate fortunes forced to fly from place of their birth, on account of their poverty or their crime. Some were undone by lawsuits, others spent all they had in drinking, whoring, gaming, and others fled for treason, many of murder, theft, poisoning, robbery or perjury, forgery, coining false money, or committing rapes or sodomy, or for flying from the colour, or deserting to the enemy, and most of them had broken prison. None of these durst return into their native countries for fear of being hanged, or starving in a jail. And therefore we were under a necessity of seeking a livelihood in other places. During this discourse my master was pleased to interrupt me several times. I had made the many circumlocutions and described to him the nature of several crimes, for which most of our crew had been forced to fly from their own country. This labour took me several days' conversation before he was able to comprehend me. He was wholly at loss to know what could be a use or necessity of practising those vices. To clear up, I endeavoured to give him some idea of the power and riches, of the terrible effects of lust, impertinence, malice, and envy. All this I was forced to define and describe by putting of cases and making of suppositions, after which, like most whose imagination was struck with something they had never seen or heard before, would lift up his eyes with amazement and indignation. Power, government, war, law, punishment, and a thousand other things that had no term wherein that language could express themselves, which made the difficulty almost insuperable to give my master any conception of what I meant. But, being of excellent understanding, and much improved by the completion in converse, he at last arrived at what a competent knowledge of what human nature in our parts of the world is capable to perform, and desired I would give him some particular account of that land which we call Europe, but especially of my own country.